There are moments in life when the world seems to pause, when every eye turns to witness a scene that most will soon forget, except the one who lived it. That evening, in a small, dimly lit diner tucked between glass towers of a city that never sleeps, such a moment unfolded. The smell of burnt coffee clung to the air, mixing with the faint hiss of the fryer. Neon lights buzzed outside the window, flickering against the glass like broken promises. The diner was nothing special: scratched tables, worn vinyl booths, a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. But it was here, in this forgotten corner of the city, that humiliation and destiny collided. At the counter, a girl, no older than 17, stood clutching a handful of coins. Her hands trembled, not just from nerves but from hunger. Every coin clicked against the counter like a reminder of how little she had, how far she was from the life others enjoyed so easy. She wasn't dressed for luxury. Her shoes were scuffed, her jacket too thin for the winter winds that howled outside. But what stood out most was not what she wore, but the way she carried herself, a quiet dignity in the face of mockery. Behind the counter, the waitress smirked. Her laughter was sharp, cutting through the diner like glass breaking. To her, the sight of a poor girl counting change for a meal was entertainment, a cruel joke in an otherwise uneventful night. A few customers chuckled, joining in the invisible chorus of judgment that fills rooms like these. And for a moment, the girl seemed to shrink beneath the weight of it all. But then she lifted her chin. Her lips parted, and what came out silenced. The room. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't an excuse, it was a voice. A sound so raw, so powerful, it seemed to shake the walls themselves. She sang, not timidly, not as if she were begging for approval, but as if she had been born to release a truth too heavy to keep inside any longer. Her voice soared like an echo of pain and hope woven together. A sound so hauntingly familiar, it brought tears to eyes that had just moments earlier been filled with laughter. It was as though Whitney Houston herself had stepped into that diner, her spirit flowing through this girl, transforming shame into a symphony. The coins no longer mattered. The waitress's smirk faded, replaced by the stunned silence of someone confronted with a force greater than their cruelty. The customers stopped eating, forks suspended in midair. Even the flickering neon outside seemed to still, as if the entire city had bowed in reverence. I was there that night, not as a diner, not as a customer. I was sweeping the floor near the door, the invisible man no one noticed. A black man working late shifts, cleaning after strangers, moving through life as quietly as possible. I had lived long enough to know how quickly beauty could be crushed, how often brilliance went unseen. But I saw her, and I knew at that moment the world had just changed. Her song wasn't just music, it was confession. It was hunger, abandonment, resilience, and faith, all braided into one voice. She sang like someone who had lost everything but still carried a flame no storm could extinguish. When the last note hung in the air, the diner was transformed. Strangers blinked back tears. The waitress stood frozen, her cruelty stripped bare under the weight of what she had witnessed. And the girl, she simply lowered her head, as if embarrassed by her own power, as if she hadn't realized the storm she carried in her lungs. That night, I understood something I had forgotten. Talent is not born in comfort. It is forged in pain, in silence, in the spaces where no one claps and no one listens. The world doesn't hand out stages. Sometimes, it forces you to build your own from the rubble of humiliation. She left the diner with nothing more than a cheap meal, and the same scuffed shoes she walked in with, but she carried something greater, a moment that would ripple far beyond those walls. And though no one else realized it yet, I knew this was only the beginning of her story, because when destiny calls, it rarely whispers. Sometimes, it sings. The night after her song, the city returned to its rhythm. Cars roared past, neon lights flickered, and thousands of strangers lived their lives without ever knowing what had happened inside that small diner. But for those of us who were there, the silence lingered. Something had shifted. I went back to sweeping floors, emptying bins, moving through shadows. That's what men like me did. We weren't meant to take center stage, only to hold the pieces together when no one else cared. But as I pushed my broom across the diner tiles, I kept hearing her voice. It echoed not in the air, but in the memory of my bones. She had vanished as quickly as she appeared. No name, no trace, just the ghost of a voice strong enough to break chains. And yet, I couldn't shake her from my mind. The waitress, the one who laughed, avoided eye contact the next night. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was fear. Fear that she had glimpsed something pure and powerful, something she could never tarnish again. Customers came and went, but every time the bell above the door rang, I caught myself hoping it was her. It wasn't. The truth is, poverty doesn't pause just because you have talent. Hunger doesn't care if your voice could fill arenas, and the world doesn't hand you a microphone just because you deserve one. She still lived in the shadows. I would see her sometimes, not in the diner, but on the streets. A glimpse of her crossing intersections in the cold, clutching a backpack that looked like it carried her entire world. She walked with purpose, though her shoes told the story of miles traveled and burdens carried. One night, I followed at a distance, not out of intrusion but out of concern. she turned into a community center, one of those forgotten buildings wedged between luxury condos and abandoned lots. Inside, the faint sound of a piano echoed. And then, her voice again. No coins this time, no humiliation, no smirking waitress. Just her and the piano, singing in an empty hall, as if the seats were filled with thousands. I stood in the doorway, unseen, listening as her song rose and fell like waves against a shore. Her power was undeniable, her control almost supernatural. She wasn't just good, she was breathtaking. But there were no cameras, no record labels, no audience, just the cracked walls of a community center that smelled of dust and bleach. It was then I realized the cruelest truth of all. Brilliance often lives and dies unseen, buried beneath poverty, overlooked by a world too distracted by wealth to notice the treasures in its gutters. Still, word began to spread. Not through headlines or broadcasts, but whispers. People who had been in the diner that night told others. A girl with a voice like Whitney Houston, they said, a girl who could make you cry with a single note. Whispers are fragile things, easily lost. But sometimes, if the wind is right, they travel further than anyone expects. Within weeks, I noticed new faces in the diner. Men in expensive suits who didn't belong in a place where the coffee cost $1. Women with polished nails and notebooks they never opened. They didn't come for the food. They came searching, asking questions. Who was the girl? Where did she go? Did anyone know her name? The waitress shrugged, pretending ignorance. Some regulars leaned in, eager to trade scraps of memory for the chance to feel important. But no one knew enough. She remained a ghost wrapped in mystery, her song haunting the city like a legend. I knew more than most, but I kept quiet. Not because I didn't believe in her, but because I understood the danger of being discovered too soon. Wealthy men don't search for talent out of kindness. They search for ownership. And ownership, in their world, rarely means freedom. One night, as I closed up the diner, I saw her again. She was sitting on the curb outside, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the glowing skyline across the river. I wanted to speak, to tell her I had heard her, that she wasn't invisible, but something held me back. Because I wasn't just a cleaner, I was a man who had seen this story before. I had seen talent exploited, beauty broken, voices stolen. I had seen young women promised the world, only to be left with ashes. I couldn't protect her from what was coming, but I could bear witness. The city is a cruel teacher. It whispers lies of opportunity, but it hides its claws until you're too deep to escape. And she, with all her brilliance, was walking straight into its arms. The first test came quietly. A stranger approached her after one of her community center sessions, dressed sharp, speaking smooth. He claimed to know people, claimed he could get her a stage. She hesitated, but hunger makes hesitation short-lived. Soon, she was taking buses to neighborhoods she didn't belong to, singing in rooms filled with smoke and men whose eyes lingered too long. Her voice stunned them, of course, but it wasn't respect they offered. It was contracts written in fine print, promises that would chain her talent for pennies on the dollar. I watched from afar as she walked this tightrope, desperate to escape poverty but surrounded by wolves, who smelled blood. And yet, through it all, her voice never faltered. It remained pure, even as the world tried to twist it. That purity frightened me, because purity is fragile, and fragility doesn't survive long in a city built on greed. By the end of that winter, her life had changed, though not in the way fairy tales promise. She was no longer invisible, but visibility came with a price. The whispers had reached the wrong ears. The same men who laughed at her poverty now sought to control her gift. The same city that had ignored her now wanted to exploit her. And standing in the shadows, broom in hand, I realized something chilling. Talent might open doors, but it also paints a target. And the girl who once counted coins on a diner counter was now walking into battles she couldn't yet see. But I could see them, and I knew the storm was coming. The city has a way of pretending to reward talent. But behind every smile is a contract, and behind every handshake is a chain. By spring, she was no longer just a rumor whispered about in diners. She was stepping onto small stages, cramped bars, where the lights flickered, charity events where no one paid attention until her voice commanded silence. Her fame didn't arrive like a lightning strike. It grew slowly, dangerously, like a fire in the walls of a building no one realizes is burning until it's too late. I stood in the background, always unseen, always listening. Her name wasn't written on billboards yet, but her voice was traveling. From neighborhood to neighborhood, from heart to heart. People compared her to Whitney, to Aretha, to legends who carried entire generations through sound. But comparisons are curses. They make people expect perfection, and perfection is a weight no human can bear. Her first breakthrough came when someone recorded her performance at that community center, a shaky phone video, grainy and raw, uploaded online, without her knowing. But truth doesn't need polish to shine. Within days, views climbed into the millions. The world that had ignored her suddenly demanded her. Reporters came knocking. Labels circled. And the girl who once counted coins at a diner table now had strangers calling her the next big thing. But here's the truth. Nobody tells you. Fame doesn't rescue the poor, it just drags their poverty into brighter light. She was still sleeping on couches, still skipping meals, still clutching the same worn backpack while the internet painted her as a star. I watched as she stepped into studios owned by men in $1,000 suits. They smiled too wide, their contracts thick with hidden traps. They spoke of opportunity, but their eyes spoke of control. She signed anyway. She had no choice. When your belly is empty, even poison can taste like salvation. Her world transformed overnight. Private cars picked her up, velvet ropes opened for her. Champagne glasses were placed in her hand, though she barely sipped. She was dressed in glittering gowns worth more than everything she had ever owned, combined. Her voice now echoed through halls of luxury, through rooms where chandeliers dripped with crystal. And yet, I could see the fear behind her smile. Because wealth doesn't erase memory. She remembered the coins. She remembered the laughter. She remembered hunger. And now, surrounded by luxury, she lived with the constant fear of losing it all. Fame wasn't freedom. It was a cage with gold bars. I saw the cage tighten when her handlers began changing her. The girl with raw soul was told to polish her sound, smooth her edges, tame the fire in her voice. They dressed her in gowns, too heavy for her thin frame, painted her face until she was unrecognizable, choreographed every movement as if her humanity was something to be edited out. The same men who praised her gift also feared it. They didn't want her to be real, they wanted her to be marketable. Her performances grew larger, yes, but so did the emptiness in her eyes. The same voice that once made a dusty diner tremble now filled arenas. And yet, in the silence after the applause, she stood alone. I remember one night vividly. She performed at a gala where the city's wealthiest gathered men in tuxedos, women dripping in diamonds. She sang a ballad so pure, so devastating, that even those cold hearts softened. They clapped, they cheered, they whispered her name like she was their latest discovery. But when the lights dimmed, she walked backstage, dropped the gown to the floor, and sat barefoot against the wall, tears streaking her makeup. Nobody saw her then, nobody cared. They only wanted her when the lights were on, and I thought to myself, the world doesn't love talent, it consumes it. Her rise brought envy to the waitress from the diner. The one who mocked her saw her face. On television one night, I saw her reaction when she returned to the diner, whispering to others with bitterness in her voice. She told anyone who would listen that she had always known the girl was special, rewriting her cruelty as prophecy. But I remembered the laughter. I remembered the smirk. The world forgets how it treated you the moment you succeed. But memory has sharp teeth, and they cut deeper when fame tries to rewrite your story. By summer, she had everything the world said mattered. A record deal, a stylist, a penthouse she barely lived in because her schedule was too demanding. But I could see it in her face. None of it felt like hers. Her songs were chosen for her. Her clothes were chosen for her. Even her words in interviews were written for her. She was becoming a stranger inside her own body. The city praised her, but it also drained her nights grew longer. Expectations heavier. She smiled on stage but collapsed in silence when the curtain closed, and I knew, watching from afar, that she was reaching a dangerous edge. Fame is a storm. It lifts you high, spins you around, blinds you with flashes of light, but eventually, it drops you. And the higher you rise, the harder the fall. She didn't see it yet, but I did. I saw the way her handlers looked at her, not as a woman, but as an investment. I saw the vultures circling tighter, each one demanding a piece of her soul in exchange for keeping the lights on, and I knew what was coming, because talent doesn't just rise, it breaks. Fame doesn't crumble in one moment. It erodes, piece by piece, until the person who once stood tall becomes a shadow of themselves. By the time the cracks showed, she was already running on borrowed time. Her handlers demanded more. More shows, more interviews, more songs recorded, in sterile studios where the air smelled of money, not music. They stretched her voice thin, forced her into contracts that left her exhausted and broken. What began as joy became obligation, and what began as music became noise. She was no longer the girl who sang to silence a diner. She was a product, and products are made to be sold until they're used up. The first betrayal came from those she trusted most. A friend from the old neighborhood, someone who once shared her hunger, who once lent her a jacket when the nights grew cold, resurfaced in her life. At first, it seemed like comfort, a reminder of who she used to be. They laughed about old struggles, about days when a sandwich split between two people felt like a feast. But hunger changes people. Fame doesn't just feed you, it feeds those who cling to you. Her friends saw her not as a sister in struggle, but as a lifeline. Slowly, requests began to surface. Small at first, a loan here, a favor there, then larger. Until the truth could no longer be ignored, the friendship had become another transaction. And when she refused, the knife turned. Secrets were spilled to tabloids. Stories twisted into lies. Betrayal, not from strangers in suits, but from someone she had once trusted with her soul. But the deeper betrayal came from the industry itself. Her label decided she wasn't marketable enough. They whispered behind closed doors that her sound needed reinvention. They hired new writers who didn't understand her story, new producers who buried her raw voice under heavy beats. They stripped away her soul and replaced it with something hollow, something that sold well in commercials but rang false in her heart. When she resisted, they reminded her of the contract, reminded her of the fine print, reminded her that they owned her music, her name, even her silence. And the girl who once carried a flame brighter than the city lights found herself trapped in darkness once more. The fall wasn't public at first. It began in hotel rooms, with sleepless nights and untouched meals. Her voice, once limitless, began to crack under the weight of exhaustion. She canceled shows, not because she didn't care, but because her body couldn't keep up with the machine she had been chained to. The press painted her as difficult, as ungrateful. They turned her exhaustion into scandal, her humanity into weakness. And the same crowd that had once risen to their feet in awe now whispered that she was finished. I saw her one night, long after the spotlight dimmed, was back near the diner, sitting on the same curb where she once stared at the skyline. But this time, her eyes were hollow. She held no backpack, no coins, no signs of hunger, yet she looked hungrier than ever. Because hunger isn't always for food. Sometimes it's for peace. The storm hit harder when her label cut ties. They had squeezed her dry, and when the profits dipped, they discarded her like yesterday's news. Overnight, the penthouse emptied. The cars disappeared. Friends stopped answering calls. Luxury had left her, but its shadow remained. She was no longer poor in the way she had been before. Poverty with memory is heavier. Once you've tasted wealth, returning to nothing feels like death. And that's where she stood, between who she had been and who the world had tried to turn her into. With no clear path forward. I knew she was breaking because I had lived it in my own way. Years earlier, I too had dreams. Not of music, but of building something. Of lifting my family out of struggle. I worked 2 jobs, sacrificed sleep, handed every dollar to bills and debts. And still, I lost more than I gained. That's why I swept floors in silence now. Because dreams, once broken, don't always rebuild. Watching her, I feared she would suffer the same fate. But there was something different about her, something the world couldn't erase, no matter how hard it tried. Her voice, it was cracked, yes, weary, yes, but not gone. The breaking point came one evening when she tried to perform again, unannounced. At a small club downtown, she wanted to remind herself why she had started, why music had once felt like survival. The stage was nothing like the arenas she had filled. Just a microphone, a stool, and a crowd of strangers sipping cheap drinks. But when she opened her mouth, her voice faltered. The high notes slipped. The control wasn't there. The audience looked at her not with awe, but with pity. And for the first time, she walked off stage not in triumph, but in shame. Her gift, the one thing that had carried her through hunger and humiliation, had betrayed her. Or so she thought. But I knew better. The gift wasn't gone. It was buried beneath pain. And pain doesn't silence talent. It reshapes it. That night, as she left the club, her head bowed, I wanted to step forward. To tell her I had been there from the beginning. To tell her she wasn't alone. But I didn't. Because sometimes, words can't heal. Sometimes, a person has to break before they can rebuild. And she was breaking. The girl who silenced a diner, with her voice now walked the streets in silence. Unseen once more, but I had a feeling this wasn't the end. Because storms don't just destroy. They cleared the sky, and her storm was far from over. The storm passed slowly, not in silence, but in echoes of laughter that once mocked her, of applause that once adored her, of contracts that once owned her. When everything was stripped away, all that remained was the voice inside her chest, raw and trembling, asking one question: who am I without the stage? For weeks, she disappeared. The city moved on, hungry for the next sensation. Headlines that once praised her now ridiculed her. Her name trended not for her songs, but for her fall. The world loves to build idols, only to watch them crumble. And yet, in that silence, she began to breathe again. I saw her one Sunday morning, walking into a church tucked in the heart of the neighborhood she had once fled. No cameras, no glitter, just a small wooden cross and a congregation of people who had carried burdens heavier than her own. She sat in the back pew, head bowed, until a voice from the pulpit asked if anyone wanted to sing. She hesitated. The wounds were fresh. Her voice had failed her before. But then she stood. No microphone, no spotlight, no orchestra. Just her and the quiet hum of an old piano, and when she sang, it wasn't perfect. The high notes cracked. The edges were rough. But it was real. It was hers. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't singing for money, or for fame, or for survival. She was singing for her soul. The congregation rose, not in applause, but in tears. Because broken voices carry truths polished ones never can. From there, her path was no longer about fame. It was about healing. She volunteered at that church, teaching children to sing, reminding them that talent is a gift, not a currency. She found joy in small moments, in laughter, in community. in songs sung off-key but full of heart. Word of her return spread again, but not through tabloids, through whispers of hope. Parents spoke of a woman who lifted their children's spirits. Neighbors spoke of a voice that carried healing. And slowly, people began to find her once more. This time the men in suits didn't come. The wolves had moved on. But the people who came now weren't predators. They were seekers. They wanted not a product, but a story. One night, she was invited to perform at a local benefit concert. Nothing glamorous, just a gathering to raise funds for struggling families. She hesitated, but agreed. The night of the show, the lights were dim, the stage small. The seats filled not with billionaires but with the weary faces of people who knew hunger, who knew struggle, who knew pain. She stepped onto the stage, barefoot, wearing nothing but a simple white dress. And when she sang, the sound that came out wasn't Whitney, wasn't Aretha, wasn't anyone else. It was her, raw, true, redeemed, and the audience wept, because in her breaking, she had found something stronger than perfection. Authenticity. I stood in the back of that hall, broom still in hand, always in the shadows, always watching. I realized then that she had given me something too. Proof that broken dreams don't always die. Sometimes they transform. We live in a world obsessed with crowns, with trophies, with applause. But the truth she uncovered is this: the greatest victories are not found in arenas filled with strangers, but in moments when you sing for those who truly hear you. The waitress who laughed at her. She faded into the background, her cruelty forgotten, her name erased by history. The wolves in suits. They moved on to their next victim, leaving her untouched at last, and the girl who once counted coins in humiliation. She had become more than a singer. She had become a testimony. Her story did not end in glittering fame or endless riches. It ended in something purer, freedom. She sang when she wanted. She taught when she wanted. She lived not for applause, but for peace. And though the world may never carve her name into its marble halls, those who heard her voice would never forget. Because her song wasn't about perfection. It was about survival, about grace, about redemption. And as I pushed my broom across another empty floor, I thought of all the lives like hers, the ones the world mocks, overlooks, discards, voices buried in poverty, dreams suffocated by hunger. Most will never be discovered. Most will never stand on stages. But their worth is not measured by headlines or applause. It is measured in the quiet resilience of choosing to rise. Again and again, even when no one is watching. She was proof of that. A girl once laughed at for counting coins, who sang like Whitney Houston, and found herself again, not in fame, but in freedom. And maybe that is the truest success of all.